It began on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind where conversation fills the air like static, the hum of microphones steady, the warmth of the studio lights turning skin to gold. Joe Rogan leaned back in his chair, headphones on, the familiar comfort of routine surrounding him. Across the table, his guest laughed, unaware that within seconds the mood would shift. The clip rolled. Trump's voice, brash, certain, unyielding, filled the studio. At first, it was just another soundbite, but then the words cut deeper, sharper. He wasn't joking this time. He was endorsing something that betrayed his own past, his own crowd, the very principles he once built his image on. The laughter died. Rogan's smile faded. He blinked once, then again, eyes narrowing, as if trying to see through the screen. His hands came together. Slow, deliberate, and for a moment, all you could hear was the faint buzz of the mics. "Man," he murmured, voice low, almost reluctant. "That's just not it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged. It was the silence of millions watching, commuters on their phones, gym-goers pausing mid-set, fans in bars and bedrooms leaning forward, waiting for the familiar ease to return. It didn't. Rogan shifted. A man suddenly realizing that something he thought he understood, something so deeply woven into the American psyche, had changed shape before his eyes. The guest cleared his throat, tried to lighten the mood. "He's just, being Trump." Rogan didn't respond. His eyes stayed on the screen. "Maybe. Or maybe he's showing us who he's always been." The air felt colder. The studio, usually a place of laughter, tangents, wild detours, now seemed like a confessional. A reckoning for years. Joe Rogan had been the mirror of middle America, skeptical, unpolished, open to anyone who made sense, and fearless with those who didn't. But that mirror just cracked, and on the other side of that silence, the question began to echo, from podcasts to headlines to every scrolling thumb across America. If even Joe Rogan felt uneasy. What exactly did Donald Trump just do? By dawn, the silence had become noise. Clips from Rogan's studio flooded the internet. 10 seconds of hesitation, 3 words of disappointment, and suddenly, everyone had an opinion. Some called it betrayal. Others called it bravery. Most just called it confusing. For years, Joe Rogan had been the voice people turned to when they couldn't trust the noise. He was the skeptic's philosopher, the barstool Socrates, the man who could talk about aliens and politics in the same breath without losing his grounding. He was unpolished, unpredictable, but that was his charm. He said what others wouldn't and asked what others feared. And for a long time, Trump's base loved that. They saw Rogan as their unofficial spokesman, the truth-teller who didn't bend to political correctness, the guy who'd call out hypocrisy no matter who wore the suit. When Rogan questioned liberal media narratives, they cheered. When he mocked elite hypocrisy, they nodded along. In him, they saw the rarest kind of man, one who seemed free. But now that same voice, the voice they trusted, was wavering. Trump's latest move had crossed a line that Rogan's moral compass couldn't ignore. Whether it was the betrayal of his own supporters, a moral contradiction too glaring to justify, or a decision that reeked of arrogance, it didn't matter. What mattered was that Rogan felt it. The same man who laughed through conspiracies now sat in uneasy silence. And America felt that silence like a pulse. On Reddit, users argued in endless threads. Wait, is Rogan turning on Trump? He's just disappointed, bro. Don't make it political. No, man. This is different. You can hear it in his voice. Twitter, or what was now called X, buzzed with irony and outrage. Memes of Rogan's face froze mid-stare. YouTube reaction channels went live, parsing every pause, every exhale, every flicker of doubt. It wasn't just a podcast moment anymore. It was cultural whiplash. Because when Rogan flinched, it wasn't about Trump alone. It was about the millions who had followed Rogan's lead, trusting his gut when they couldn't trust anyone else's. For years, he had been the bridge between right and left, working class and celebrity, fighter and philosopher. People who felt unseen found validation in his bluntness. Immigrants, veterans, misfits, they all saw something in Rogan's defiance, his refusal to play anyone's game. And now, Even he was struggling to stomach what America's loudest voice had become. The narration deepens. If even Joe Rogan starts to lose faith, what happens to the millions who look to him for clarity? The question lingered over airwaves and comment sections alike. For once, the man who prided himself on having no tribe had found himself in the middle of a civil war, not between parties, but between truth and ego. Some fans pleaded for patience. Others turned away. The divide wasn't red or blue anymore. It was belief versus exhaustion. America watched a mirror crack, not in anger, but in quiet recognition that maybe, just maybe, everyone had been following reflections instead of reality. And in that fractured reflection, one truth began to take shape. When the man who stood for independence starts to question his allies, the whole country starts to wonder who's really independent at all. But to understand why this moment cut so deep, we have to look at who Joe Rogan became. And who Donald Trump used to be. It began with lights, blinding, theatrical, almost holy in their glow. The camera panned across a sea of red caps, faces tilted upward like pilgrims waiting for revelation. Make America great again. It wasn't just a slogan. It was scripture for the disillusioned. And at the pulpit stood a man who had built his entire existence on two things: dominance and spectacle. Donald Trump didn't step into politics. He marched into it, flanked by ego and applause. The cadence of his rallies was unlike anything the country had seen. Part entertainment, part exorcism. He didn't just talk. He performed. Every insult was a punchline, every boast a sermon. People laughed, gasped, cheered. They weren't just voting for him. They were feeling him. For millions, Trump was rebellion in human form. A symbol of defiance against polished hypocrisy, against invisible elites who spoke the language of empathy but lived above consequence. To them, he wasn't the villain the media portrayed. He was the anti-hero who didn't need permission to exist, and in that image, he thrived. But behind the bravado, something darker pulsed. Trump's power wasn't sustained by love. It was fueled by loyalty. And not the kind that's earned through trust, but demanded through fear. Those who praised him were exalted. Those who questioned him, erased. Journalists became targets. Officials who once stood proudly beside him became enemies overnight. Generals, advisors, even lifelong allies, all discarded the moment they hesitated. The phrase, "you're fired," was no longer entertainment. It was doctrine. The pattern repeated, hypnotic and cruel. The circle of trust always shrinking, the echo chamber growing louder. He built castles out of crowds, thrones out of headlines, and when the applause stopped, he built new enemies to reignite it. Trump's charisma was undeniable. He could walk into a room and command oxygen itself. Even his critics couldn't look away. But beneath the magnetism lay chaos, the kind that confuses domination with strength and conflates applause with truth. He wasn't born a monster. He was born into mirrors. Cameras had reflected him his entire life, from glossy magazine covers to the golden glow of reality TV. He learned early that the more outrageous the act, the longer the spotlight lingered. Politics was just the final stage, and America, exhausted, divided, cynical, gave him what he craved most: an audience. At first, it felt refreshing. The blunt talk, the irreverence, the swagger. But then came the cracks, the scapegoats, the paranoia, the rewriting of loyalty itself. Suddenly, to disagree was to betray, and to betray was to vanish. One by one, those who believed they could temper him fell away. The generals with medals, the lawyers with experience, the aides with moral compasses. Even supporters who had stood by him through scandal began whispering doubts. Still, the show went on. The rallies roared. The slogans evolved. And the myth deepened. Trump became more than a man. He became a test. A test of how much contradiction a nation could endure before truth lost its meaning. Because what made him powerful wasn't policy or vision. It was the mirror he held up to America's fractures. People saw what they wanted to see: a savior, a fighter, a villain, a voice. And he saw all of them as pawns in his reflection. Narration slows, heavy with irony. He promised to drain the swamp, yet surrounded himself with opportunists. He vowed to speak for the forgotten, yet could not tolerate being questioned. He built his empire on loyalty, but only the kind that silences conscience. The crowds kept chanting, but the rhythm began to hollow. The slogans echoed against reality. Even his most loyal followers started feeling the fatigue, the endless feuds, the constant drama, the wars that never ended, and somewhere, amid the noise and neon, the illusion began to tremble. The mask didn't slip all at once. It cracked at the edges with every contradiction that demanded blind faith. Trump was never just a politician. He was a performance, one that grew too big to control, too loud to ignore, too fragile to sustain, and like every show built on dominance, it was only a matter of time before someone refused to play their role. Someone who thrived on independence, who spoke in long-form truths instead of sound bites. Someone who had built their own empire, not from power, but from credibility. That someone was Joe Rogan. Before the microphones, before the political labels, before the headlines that tried to define him, Joe Rogan was just a kid who didn't fit in any box. Comedy was his first rebellion, the stage, his confessional. Under dim lights and cigarette haze, he learned the rhythm of honesty, setup, truth, punchline. It wasn't about laughter for him. It was about freedom. In the 1990s, he fought for rent money, gig to gig, training jiu-jitsu by day and bombing on stage by night. The mat and the mic, two battlegrounds that taught him the same thing. You can't fake your way through pain. The crowd can smell fear. The fighter can sense lies. Those lessons forged him into something rare. Someone who could take a hit, physical or verbal, and still smile back. By the time podcasting arrived, he wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing curiosity. He didn't want to perform for the world. He wanted to understand it. And that's how it began. 2 mics, a few friends, unfiltered conversations about everything from psychedelics to politics, aliens to free speech. What no one expected was that millions would join in. The Joe Rogan Experience became the world's biggest living room, part therapy session, part philosophy circle, part roast. And as institutions began to crumble, media losing trust, politicians losing credibility, Rogan's rawness became a refuge. He wasn't a journalist. He wasn't an academic. He was something more dangerous, a man with no script. Audiences from every corner tuned in because he didn't talk at them. He talked with them. He asked the questions they were afraid to ask. When CNN lied, he called it out. When Fauci stumbled, he pressed harder. When Biden fumbled or Trump blustered, Rogan didn't care whose side he was supposed to be on. He cared about the truth, and that's what made him untouchable. He didn't owe anyone loyalty, not corporations, not parties, not narratives. He built a kingdom from conversation and guarded it with skepticism. His listeners didn't worship him. They trusted him because he seemed incorruptible, the kind of man who'd call BS on anyone, even himself. As America grew louder and more divided, Rogan stayed in the middle, not because it was safe, but because it was honest. "Everyone's full of shit," he once laughed on air. "And the sooner you accept that, the freer you are." It was funny, but it was also gospel. He became, unwillingly, the voice of the in-between, the misfits, the immigrants, the working-class dreamers who didn't see themselves in the polished smiles of politicians or the sneering anchors of TV news. They saw themselves in the guy in a hoodie, drinking black coffee, asking why everything that used to make sense suddenly didn't. Rogan wasn't chasing controversy. He was chasing clarity in a world that profits off confusion, and people responded to that honesty like oxygen. Every episode was a rebellion against pretense. Every guest, scientist, comedian, or fighter became part of a bigger idea. That truth can't survive behind paywalls and podiums. It has to live where people live, in conversation, in disagreement, in laughter. That's what made his slow disillusionment with Trump hit differently. He hadn't joined the populist bandwagon. He hadn't worn the hat or chanted the slogans. But he had understood why people loved Trump. The defiance, the fight, the middle finger to the elite. Rogan admired the energy, not the ego. He saw in Trump's rise something primal, America's hunger for authenticity, and yet as the years went on, that hunger began to rot. The performance grew bigger, the humility smaller. What began as rebellion started looking like addiction, to attention, to dominance, to never being wrong. Rogan noticed it slowly, the way you notice a friend changing, not overnight, but in gestures. The need to always win, the inability to admit fault, the transformation of conviction into spectacle. He'd defended Trump before, not out of loyalty, but fairness. "People hate him so much they'll lie just to justify it," he once said. But lately, even Rogan's patience was thinning. Every time Trump spoke, it felt less like leadership and more like theater. The lines rehearsed, the outrage predictable. Rogan could forgive mistakes. He couldn't forgive fakery, because that was the line he'd drawn since day one, the invisible boundary between authenticity and manipulation. It was what separated his show from propaganda, his humor from cruelty, his curiosity from bias. And now Trump, the man who once embodied the spirit of defiance Rogan respected, had crossed it. Rogan didn't shout. He didn't rant. He didn't post hashtags or make speeches. He just went quiet, the kind of quiet that means something's broken. That moment in the studio wasn't planned. It wasn't performative. It was a man realizing, live on air, that the person who once stood for rebellion had become the thing he rebelled against. Millions felt it with him. The sting of disappointment, the ache of watching a symbol crumble, because when someone like Rogan loses faith, it isn't about politics. It's about trust. The trust that truth is still out there somewhere, buried under noise. The trust that honesty still matters more than applause. And the trust that even in a country divided, there are voices brave enough to stand alone. So when Trump crossed that invisible line, Rogan didn't just react. He recoiled. The episode began like any other. A guest Rogan admired, a political scientist known for dissecting American populism, sat across the table, sipping from the signature black mug. The topic was supposed to be light, leadership in crisis. But as the conversation edged toward Trump's recent decision, the one that shook Rogan's faith, something in the air shifted. Cameras rolled. The neon glow from the studio screens flickered across Rogan's face. He leaned forward, hands clasped, the familiar mix of curiosity and irritation in his eyes. "You know," he began, "I defended the guy when people called him a narcissist. I thought, maybe he's just a fighter. But this?" He paused. "This feels weak." His guest tilted his head. "Weak how?" "You can't claim to be anti-establishment and then become the establishment," Rogan said, voice tightening. He built his image on calling out corruption, then turns around and plays the same game. "That's not strength. That's hypocrisy." The room grew still. The laughter that usually punctuated Rogan's episodes was gone. The conversation had crossed a line into something raw, unscripted, dangerous. They talked about it all, the betrayals, the reversals, the contradictions. The guest brought up examples. Trump aligning with corporate elites he once mocked, silencing critics he once promised to empower. Rogan listened, nodding slowly. "I thought he was tougher than this," he said finally, his voice low. "Smarter. Maybe I was wrong. That single line hit like a gunshot. Within minutes, Reddit threads ignited. Twitter, or what was now called X, flooded with clips. "Rogan turns on Trump." Read one headline. Others pushed back, calling it a betrayal, a setup, a media ploy. But it wasn't. It was something far simpler. A man processing disappointment in real time. The studio, usually a sanctuary for curiosity, had become a battlefield of conviction. Rogan's producer, off-camera, sensed it too. The tension was electric. The kind of silence you could feel in your teeth. Rogan wasn't angry. He was hurt. "You can make mistakes," he continued, "but when you start believing your own myth, that's when you lose touch with reality. That's when you stop serving people and start serving yourself." The guest nodded, but there was no comfort in the exchange. It wasn't a takedown. It was an autopsy of a movement, of trust, of the illusion that power and authenticity could coexist for long. As the conversation deepened, Rogan's thoughts drifted beyond Trump. He spoke about how truth itself had become a casualty, how every leader now sold certainty instead of honesty. People don't want nuance anymore, he said. They want someone to believe for them. He stared into the lens, not at his guest, not even at Trump, but at the millions watching. That's the real danger, he said. When you hand over your thinking to someone else, no matter how much you like them, you've already lost. Those words lingered long after the episode ended. Clips spread across social media like wildfire, reaction videos, podcasts responding to the podcast, panels on cable news analyzing the tone of his voice, the twitch of his jaw. The world had just witnessed something rare in modern media, a public figure choosing integrity over allegiance. It wasn't just a podcast. It was a public divorce. Rogan didn't plan it that way. He never does. But his honesty, unpolished, unfiltered, had once again cracked the surface of America's political illusion. Fans were split. Some praised him for standing up to the idol he once defended. Others called him a traitor, a sellout, proof that everyone caves eventually. But the truth was more complicated. Rogan hadn't changed. He had evolved. He wasn't walking away from Trump. He was walking back toward himself. The outro music faded, but the silence that followed was louder than anything said on air. It was the silence of realization that the man who'd built a career speaking truth to power had just spoken truth about power, and across the internet, the question began to echo. If even Rogan's done with Trump, what happens now? Narration slows, voice heavy with suspense. But Rogan wasn't done. His next words would light up America's airwaves. The air in the studio was thick, not with tension, but with clarity. Rogan sat back for a moment, exhaling through his nose, eyes steady but heavy. The guest across from him stayed silent, sensing what was about to happen. Rogan's fingers tapped against the mic, a faint, rhythmic pulse. He leaned in. "This isn't about left or right," he said quietly, the words deliberate, heavy as lead. "It's about honesty. You can't claim to be for the people and play them like props." The silence that followed was electric. His guest blinked, unsure whether to nod or stay still. The camera zoomed slightly, capturing Rogan's face not as a host's, but as a citizen's, tired, clear-eyed, done pretending. Then the narration cuts in, smooth and cinematic. In one sentence, Rogan shattered the illusion that loyalty meant silence. The clip hit the internet like a detonator. Within an hour, it was everywhere. YouTube reaction thumbnails screaming in red fonts, TikTok edits syncing his quote to swelling music, Reels captioned with, "Finally, someone said it." News outlets pounced. Fox spun it as a betrayal. MSNBC called it vindication. Independent creators turned it into prophecy. The line echoed in every corner of the digital world. From barbershops to boardrooms, you can't claim to be for the people and play them like props, even the guest. Off camera later, admitted he'd felt something shift. It wasn't just Joe calling out Trump, he said. It was him calling out all of us, the whole culture of blind faith. By nightfall, the internet had split into two armies. One side rallied behind Rogan, memes of him with the caption "Truth Tribe." The other side declared him compromised, a traitor bought by the elites. Trump's camp moved fast. His spokesperson released a statement within hours, dismissing Rogan's comments as misinformed and taken out of context. Surrogates flooded social media, reminding followers that Rogan was never truly one of us. But the damage was done, because for the first time, the man who had floated above the political trenches had landed, and when he did, the ground shook. Rogan didn't backtrack. He didn't clarify. He doubled down. "Look," he said in a follow-up episode, "I'm not anti-Trump. I'm anti-bullshit. And I don't care who it comes from." The word hung there, bullshit, raw, unfiltered, unmistakable. The guest that day, a former Navy SEAL, chuckled uneasily. "You know that's going to piss people off," he warned. Rogan shrugged. "Good. Maybe it should." The narration takes over again, painting the moment with cinematic gravity. For years, America had lived on outrage, feeding off it, defining itself through it. But this was something different. This was truth stripped of team colors, montage, millions of screens glowing across living rooms and phones, workers on lunch breaks rewatching the clip, college students debating it in cafeterias, truck drivers listening to it on Spotify somewhere between Amarillo and Tulsa. For a fleeting moment, honesty felt revolutionary. Clips of politicians trying to spin Rogan's words flooded cable news. Senators dodged questions about whether they agreed. Campaign strategists whispered about the Rogan factor, whether his influence could swing the independents. Even late-night hosts who once mocked him began quoting him. "I mean, he's right," one host said with a smirk. "You can't say you're for the people while living like a pharaoh." Meanwhile, Trump himself stayed silent. For 2 days, nothing. His social media feed, usually a storm of capital letters and exclamation marks, went still. Insiders claimed he was furious, not because Rogan criticized him, but because Rogan's criticism stuck. Behind the scenes, aides scrambled to craft a response that wouldn't make things worse. One advisor leaked, "He hates that Rogan's words sound like something he would have said back in 2016, before the power got to him." And in that irony lay the story's power. Rogan hadn't attacked Trump. He had out-Trumped him by reclaiming the authenticity Trump had once sold to America. The narration deepens. In an era where truth was currency and outrage was economy, Rogan had just declared bankruptcy on bullshit, and people were listening. Clips continued to spread. Influencers quoted him. Athletes reposted the soundbite. Immigrant entrepreneurs, union workers, podcasters, all found a strange unity in that single statement. For once, the line between us and them blurred into something simple. Everyone was tired of being lied to. In comment sections, the sentiment repeated like a drumbeat. "He said what we're all thinking. This isn't left or right anymore." Finally, someone's got the balls to call it out, and beneath the noise, there was catharsis. That primal relief of watching someone speak the truth you were too afraid to say aloud. The narration slows, almost reverent. It was the rarest kind of moment, when one man's disappointment became an entire nation's mirror. Then, the visuals tighten again. Rogan sitting in his dimly lit studio, sipping water, unbothered by the storm he's unleashed. The camera catches his reflection in the glass. Weary, resolute. He knows what's coming. The backlash, the distortion. The way truth gets twisted into sides and clicks. But he also knows something else. Once you speak it, you can't unsay it. Off camera, his producer mutters, "You broke the internet again." Rogan smirks faintly. "No," he says. The truth did, cut to black. Then, the narration returns, slower now, darker. But the real shock came in the days that followed, when even Trump's most loyal backers started to flinch. The sound fades to the echo of that one line. "You can't claim to be for the people and play them like props." The words that once felt like an opinion now sounded like an epitaph. The morning after Rogan's truth bomb, the internet didn't wake up. It detonated. Hashtags exploded like fireworks across every platform. Rogan turns. Trump betrayal. Truth over tribe. Each one pulsed with digital adrenaline, carrying millions of arguments, confessions, and reckonings. TikTok stitched Rogan's calm critique beside Trump's defiant rallies. Twitter turned into an ideological war zone. Reddit lit up with long threads that read like public therapy sessions. "I used to think Rogan was on Trump's side," one user wrote. "Now I think maybe he was just on the side of common sense." "He's lost it," another shot back. "He's becoming what he used to mock." But the comment that went viral wasn't angry. It was weary. Maybe loyalty shouldn't mean blindness. It was reposted 1,000,000 times. Cable news couldn't resist. Within hours, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC ran split-screen debates, each claiming Rogan's awakening as validation of their own truth. But no one could fully explain it, because it wasn't political, not really. It was emotional, existential. On Fox, one commentator muttered, When Joe Rogan distances himself, that's a cultural earthquake. Over on MSNBC, a guest analyst smiled thinly. "It's not about Trump losing a fan," she said. "It's about a generation losing its illusion." Clips of Rogan's line, "I'm not anti-Trump, I'm anti-bullshit," played on loop. Every outlet framed it differently. But no matter the spin, the undercurrent was the same. A man who made his name on fearless honesty had just used that honesty on one of the most powerful figures in modern politics. And people felt it. Podcasters referenced it in opening monologues. Comedians slipped it into punchlines. One veteran creator said, "It's funny, man. I thought I disagreed with Rogan on everything. But this hit. Even musicians got in on it." A viral remix dropped that night. Rogan's quote layered over a slow trap beat, looping, "You can't claim to be for the people," between drops of thunderous bass. It hit #2 on Spotify's trending chart within 24 hours. It wasn't just the sound of rebellion, it was the sound of awakening. Across YouTube, long-form creators broke down Rogan's moment like forensic analysts, frame by frame, tone by tone, reading body language, dissecting subtext. They weren't talking about politics anymore. They were talking about authenticity, about the price of staying silent too long. In living rooms, friends debated it over dinner. In gyms, trainers argued about it between sets. In classrooms, professors used it to discuss media influence. And in every corner of the internet, one uncomfortable truth kept bubbling to the surface. America had been starved of honesty for so long, it didn't know how to handle it when it finally appeared. The narration softens, drawing out the emotion. For a fleeting moment, America remembered how to think, not follow, how to question, not obey, and how to listen, not to the loudest voice, but to the truest one. Then came the backlash, not from Trump's camp this time, but from those who needed Rogan to stay in his box. The left, the right, the centrists, each side had defined him by their own convenience. Now, his refusal to pick a tribe made everyone uncomfortable. Influencers who'd once bragged about getting Rogan's nod started distancing themselves. Networks scrambled to reinterpret the clip. One late-night host joked, "America's favorite fence-sitter finally picked a side, and it's his own." The audience laughed, but uneasily, because beneath the comedy, there was a truth they couldn't shake. Rogan's defiance wasn't betrayal. It was liberation. He hadn't switched sides. He'd reminded people there was another way to think. A harder, lonelier, freer way. And while his critics squabbled, his audience grew stronger, not in numbers, but in conviction. Listeners who'd once tuned in for laughs were now tuning in for perspective, for honesty that didn't care who it offended. One viral post summed it up perfectly. Joe Rogan just did something most politicians haven't in decades. He told the truth even when it cost him. The firestorm had burned through the headlines. The hashtags began to fade. The algorithms moved on. But somewhere in the quiet, what lingered wasn't outrage. It was reflection. Rogan's studio felt calmer now. The lights were softer, his tone measured. The fury had passed. What remained was something more honest, more human. He wasn't lecturing, he was thinking aloud. "You know," he said, voice low, almost weary, "it's not betrayal to question someone you once admired. It's maturity, it's growth. You can't stay loyal to a version of someone that doesn't exist anymore." The guest beside him nodded, and for a rare moment, Rogan smiled. Not the smirk of defiance, but the faint, knowing grin of a man who'd just learned something about himself. The narration takes over, gentle but resonant. Maybe this wasn't just about Trump. Maybe it was about America learning to grow up, to trade worship for wisdom, and loyalty for accountability. For years, the nation had lived in absolutes, heroes or villains, patriots or traitors, right or wrong. But what Rogan had done, perhaps without even meaning to, was reintroduce the middle ground, that uncomfortable, necessary space where truth lives. Disillusionment, the narration continues, isn't the end of faith. It's the beginning of understanding, because to question isn't to destroy, it's to rebuild. to re-examine what you believed and decide if it still fits who you've become. In Rogan's reflection, America saw its own. The nation that once prided itself on rugged independence had become addicted to certainty, to strong men, slogans, and the illusion of clarity. But real strength, as Rogan quietly reminded millions, isn't found in never being wrong. It's found in admitting when you are. Clips resurfaced of Rogan's past contradictions, old jokes, controversial takes, mistakes he'd owned and learned from. To some, those clips were ammunition. To others, they were proof the man was still evolving, still questioning, still refusing to let ego fossilize him. He wasn't trying to be perfect. He was trying to be honest, and that, the narration swells, is what America forgot to celebrate. The camera pans over images of protest signs, podcast mics, scrolling feeds, the faces of people arguing, thinking, wondering. The sound fades into a heartbeat, steady, human, collective. When truth becomes tribal, the narrator says, pausing just long enough to let it breathe, honesty becomes rebellion. That line ripples through the silence like a slow, unstoppable wave. Because it isn't just a slogan, it's a mirror. It's the moment a society realizes that questioning power, any power, isn't disloyalty. It's democracy. Rogan, ever the reluctant philosopher, summed it up best in one line that went almost unnoticed amid the chaos. Maybe we don't need perfect heroes, just honest ones. It was simple, disarming, unscripted, but it hit like a revelation, because maybe America didn't need idols anymore. Maybe it needed mirrors, flawed, uncertain, evolving mirrors, to remind it that truth doesn't belong to one man, one party, or one platform. The narration softens, almost whispering, we grow not by defending our illusions, but by outgrowing them. The camera returns to Rogan, alone now, his voice fading into the hum of the studio equipment. He takes off his headphones, leans back, exhales. There's no triumph in his face, only peace, the kind that comes after you finally stop pretending to know all the answers. And as his studio lights dim, the narrator delivers the final reflection. Maybe this was never about one man's disappointment. Maybe it was about a nation rediscovering its conscience, one uncomfortable truth at a time. Beat. Silence. And in that realization, the voice concludes, lies America's quiet revolution. The studio is quiet again. No viral storm, no chaos, just the low hum of the equipment and the glow of a single red light above the mic. Rogan sits back in his chair, eyes tracing the cables that snake across the floor, lost in thought. The world outside is still arguing, still interpreting. But in here, there's only stillness. The narration returns, soft and resonant. The mic went silent that day, but the echo never stopped. Because what began as a moment of disillusionment had turned into something deeper, a mirror held up to a country that had forgotten how to look at itself. Rogan's hesitation, his honesty, his doubt, they weren't weaknesses. They were reminders that strength isn't loud and truth doesn't shout. Clips play like fading memories, his voice saying, this isn't about left or right. His pause before speaking, his final smirk. Then, the narrator speaks directly to the audience. If even the loudest voices can learn, maybe so can we. A slow piano note swells underneath, giving the moment weight. Not sorrow, but hope, because this isn't just about politics or podcasts. It's about people, about choosing reflection over rage, thought over noise, humility over certainty. The voice grows firmer, rising like a quiet anthem. Question everything. Think for yourself, and never mistake volume for truth. A final beat. The camera pulls back, the studio shrinking into darkness. The red mic light the last thing visible, pulsing like a heartbeat. Then the narrator delivers the last line, part invitation, part challenge. Share this. Not to argue, not to divide, but to awaken, fade to black. The echo remains. The mirror is still there.